Welcome back, Map 9. Today we are continuing our statistics and probability unit. Today's lesson is about using samples and population to collect data. And now we are going into chapter 3, if you will, or you can call it lesson 3. First of all, before I go through the concept and skill that is required for this entire chapter, I would like to share you some statistical application that science field is doing. So like what the title suggests on the top over here, you don't need to write down what things are discussed in here. So sit down, relax, and listen, watch. So here's the thing. If you would like to become any of a, how can I say, conservative biologist, or if you like to study ecosystem, how species and other species interact together, or some cases, even though zoology and botany is a little different, still they use this method, mark and recapture method, this will play a huge role. So first thing first, can you see that we have a carnivore? I forgot whether this was a polar bear or it's a wolf, but can you see there's a mark underneath them? So sometimes they are, it's not humane method, sometimes it's tranquilized and they have a little marker and then they're released to their ecosystem. On the other hand, when it comes to fishery business or fishing related, or if you want to point that out that as a aquatic ecosystem study, what people also do is this is before we capture, but after we capture, we put a little bit of a marker. In this case, we have a marker on salmon. Then a salmon with the marker is basically re-released to the environment. I want you to think why people, in this case conservation biologists, use this strategy called mark and recapture method. The reason we're doing that is because animals, they repopulate. Some of them die, which means it can be eaten, die with the age, and so on. But some of them, there will be increase in number because reproduction is possible in any type of season. So that's why in order to study the population, or in the end, develop a population control policy so that, let's say, human doesn't overhunt or overfish some of those species, or they can go, they can go, they can go to a politics size to share that idea like Green Party does, something like that. Basically, using this, we track the numbers with mark or no mark. That's what you can think of. So in real life, how this technology is used, you don't need to write this, of course. This is how we use. We capture some samples out of the whole population in this lake. For example, it can be ocean or any place like that too. Then we put a mark, and it can be digital for some, but most of the time it's non-digital. We put the mark, re-release, and after a certain amount of period, we do resampling, and we calculate how much species with the sample versus, with the mark or no mark can be compared statistically. So in this case, this entire infograph is actually telling you a quick math function of number of tagged fish over number of marked fish in sample. We're doing that and we get 20, and this represents how much estimated population of all fish in this specific pond. Now that is a population study and how our statistic can be applied for the field of science. Now it is a lesson time. Population. We're not talking about population in terms of science definition. Population has to have a multiple number of individual with the similar genetic makeup, aka same species. That's a scientific definition. Mathematic definition is technically referring a group, ladies and gentlemen. It refers the group about which you're getting information. So if I tell you, time to time people talk about that as, is that a survey target? Yes, most of the time, but no for some. So it both exist. And I'm gonna go through that little detail. If you deal with something I like to call census, it does every single person in a certain community as a target. A census is conducted when data is collected from literally every single number. So each number of the population. Census, however, there is a limitation. It's not cheap, it's quite expensive. And like I mentioned last time, this year I had to do census at this month, in fact, May 2021, and it is by law we are obligated to do the census. It is costly situation. I know because this is COVID, so we did it online, but most of the time there are people walking around house by house. Time consuming, talking about house to house, I'm pretty sure that example already give you why it's time consuming. Quite difficult because everybody have how can I say difficult because not everybody answer ASAP. Some people drag it all the end and procrastinate and so on. Sometimes it's impossible to complete. For example, if you cannot read, even if you are citizens in Canada and you're speaking completely different language other than English and French, now that can be a little impossible to gather every single person's data, isn't it? So there is a little realistic boundary. Census, however, is quite useful, especially it's one of the most accurate method for sure, because you are literally checking everybody's response. And it is important to pick and choose though, because it's costly, time consuming, and difficult. Generally, we use it when issue is very significant. So this year census, you can go through the census too with your parents, but there was some COVID information involved. So that is important topic during this time. And it's also useful when the population is small. So like I mentioned, probably this population study census type is useful if you're talking about conservation biologists in pond. That one is okay to do. But as soon as it become river, big lake, or sea, then even if you're talking about marine biologists and so on, it is tough to gather the sample just because it's too vast. So what is your solution if the population size is too big? The very simplest thing that you can do is I like to call sampling. You can gather some sample. If the population is huge, we get only a small portion of the population, and we need to do statistic calculation to generalize the process. Now, is that perfect? Most of the time, not really. There is a way to make things a little bit understandable though. When the sample is chosen, it should represent. It is representative of the population. And the data collected from that sample study should provide a valid conclusion. That means it should be acceptable conclusion that should apply to any other part of the population. So for instance, in Alberta, whatever the survey that we do in Edmonton, if that survey result and statistical result is applicable for Devon, Calgary, Lethbridge, Red Deer, and even the small town, Westlaw, those kind of area, then it is pretty much valid. But in real life, when it comes to a whole level of how a sample can represent the whole population of Alberta, most of the time we need more sampling. Like at least compare urban versus rural, something like that. So let's do some example. Let's explain why a population was surveyed instead of sample. Situation number 1. You can pause this video now and copy. Once you're done, let's go through. To determine the average number of siblings of his classmate. All right, so in this situation, we have a number of siblings of classmate. I want you to write down your response first, and I'm going to share with mine. So let's go through this. When it comes to population, we know that the survey that is done target classmates. So let's assume a situation. Even if you have a big class, it is still smaller than 50. The biggest class that I taught in my life is 42 students, high school, in Science 10. So in this case, the whole population is still doable because population is small to start with. So in that way, it is understandable that why Carlos decided to survey every single member instead of the sample. Because when the population is small, then using sample out of it is not recommended. Because first of all, using the sample itself make everybody assume something. Some assumptions so that you can use that discovered data as generalized pattern. And in order to do that, we have to assume. I want you to look at example number 2. Every 5 years, Statistics Canada conduct consensus. One of the questions is used to determine the ages of the people in each household. So I want you to pause this video, do your responses first. Why do you think population was surveyed instead of sample? All right, so let's look through this. First thing first, Statistics Canada conduct consensus, and then one of the main goal was determining the ages of the people. Now, if you think about it, sampling for that is not a good idea because let's say we have town A. Let's say we have town B, something like that. Town A, imagine we have age 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40. Because of space limitation, let's just do this situation. Imagine the town A happen to have 50, 50, 10 versus other town has 15 and 45 and 90, something like that. If I focus on the statistic value of town A, you will notice that way more than average is located on age group of 20 and 30. It makes 100. However, if I look at town B, there are overwhelming population happening to 30 to 40. So how can that sample that you take, I'm going to call it sample A versus sample B, how can these two negotiate in between? Then you may find that certain assumption can make the whole data invalid. That's a fancy way of saying it will become useless. So in this situation, what you can do is we better spend more money so that we can run the consensus and actually do the survey for every single household, because that cost is actually better than have weak sample study that will make the whole study into a garbage study. So that's something that I want to point that out. All right, so this is an example that I can pull it out for you related to the age consensus situation. So first thing first, I want you to look at our province, life expectancy of Alberta. Well, if you look at the diagram, we are bright blue. So we're at the category of life expectancy about 81 to 81.5. I don't know when this study happened, but that's still above than average. On the other hand, I want you to look at Nunavut and Northwest Territory and so on. When it comes to those area, as you may notice, it's below 77 or 77.5. So even when you look at province to province, it actually differs quite a bit. Because if the life expectancy is low, then you will know that the age group that takes most of the population will naturally go low because people will undergo next stage of life in Christian belief. On the other hand, when it comes above 82.5, it's kind of surprising. British Columbia has the highest, which also, now I think of it, makes sense because of good air and then good entertainment, those kind of things. Similar situation if you look at the number of fatalities, so that's how much death can occur because of fatal incident and so on. If you look at Alberta, that's also pretty high. So if you look at just two of the data, infograph more, if I suggest it from previous page to this page, previous page already told me that Alberta is not as high when it comes to the age. So what I mean by that is life expectancy was a little lower, but at the same time, when it comes to the consensus for number of fatality, it is also pretty darn high. So that means we have a lot of accidents, but at the same time, expectancy is a little lower compared to BC and others. If you look at, however, number of fatality in Nunavut and Northwest Territory, especially Nunavut, it's not as serious. There's not much of damage occurring. So in that situation, number of fatality is low, so that's why maybe we have relatively more proportion for younger situation, even though the population itself is pretty low. So let's go through this. How can we identify and critique the use of sample? I want you to put this important statement. In each case, identify data were collected from a sample or population. Wherever sample is used, explain if you think the conclusion will be valid or not. This is a question that we're going to go through, and I want you to remember we're not only identifying if it's from sample or population, but also why it is used and how that still make the whole thing valid. So that means whole data is useful. It's not useless. All right, let's do the first example. Pause the video now and write down your questions and possible answers. I'm assuming you're done. So once you finish everything, sometimes it's a good idea to highlight some. In my case, the one that I'm going to highlight is your school. Now, each students in your school look like population, but if you think about the whole big picture of it, this is sampling situation. Why? It's because, first of all, when it comes to the whole target, it was a province, but we are focusing on only local sample. Your school is a fancy way of saying local sample. You're not having a whole entire population about it. So if you poll each student in your school, well, it looked like if it's about your school policies try to ban, then there will be entire population as a study. target, but in this case, we are talking about province versus your school. That is sampling. And if it's sampling, you may know that we need assumptions to generalize. Similar as before, pause this video, copy the question, and then respond using your own words. And we are going to compare. All right, so let's go through this. Number 2, to determine which politician is expected to win in the municipal election, every citizen over 18 or whomever is eligible for voting in election is polled. This example, I like to say it's a population example. Why? Is because we have all participants are involved for your population statistic. So that's a fancy way of saying every single participant is the one that play a huge role for your, how can I say, voting slash the survey in this situation. And we don't do a sample, we don't assume anything, we don't have to generalize because we are doing the whole survey to the entire member of this society. Last example, similar deal. Pause this video, copy the question, answer your response, then we are going to compare. All right, I think you are finished up by now, assuming that you paused the video. Let's go through this. To determine the average lifetime of a type of light bulb, 150 light bulbs were selected randomly. That's a key thing, by the way, from the production line and tested. First thing first, like the word suggests, obvious thing is this is sampling, which is a fancy way of saying we are taking out some small portion out of the whole population. Now, one thing that I want to point it out to you, however, is though it came out randomly. So what does that mean? Well, because of that random sampling, and I like to call that, because of that random process, this eliminates some bias pattern. Pattern in here. So can it be generalized? I believe so. Because it was sampled, randomized, and then in order to check yes and no, simple part like yes, it's functioning well with this average time, or no, it have shortened lifetime, something like that. This should represent the whole population. That's what I want to point that out. That was today's lesson. I want you to do question number 3, 4, 5, 6 on page 440, and then 7, 8, 9 on page 441.